Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts. Here's Daniel's prompt.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. So I'd love to talk to you today about a topic that I think is really interesting, and that is the concept of land use. So I remember before I was looking at the population density that we have here in Israel, seeing how it fared internationally. I always had the impression that there are a lot of cities in Israel for the size of the country. It's a very small place. And if you think beyond Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, there are a lot more places that Israel considers cities. And I think part of that is the CBS, the Central Body of Statistics, has a very strange way of defining a city. It defines it at a low level of population. So it almost kind of seems like there are more cities than there really are. But regardless of how you classify a place, there is a very high population density. That's a fact. But what's really interesting to me about Israel is that in such a small country, the diversity of the geography is just absolutely incredible. And you kind of go from, there's a place near Jerusalem called Beit Shemesh, also classified as a city, and the drive there, which we're embarking upon, you get out of Jerusalem and then suddenly you're in kind of open territory. The most extreme example is the south. My wife and I did a amazing drive on Route 10 a few years ago, which is usually close to civilians, and that is probably the most sparsely populated part of Israel and maybe even the world that I've ever been in. There's kind of shooting ranges, there's a couple of military installations, but for a large swathe of the country, to the south of Beersheba and to the border with Egypt, there is nothing, almost no people, almost no civilization. My late grandfather, who was a traveling salesperson for the electricity poles. I don't know if it's still the case. We should populate the Negev, and I think personally that there should be I'd love to see another city in Israel that had a unique characteristic. Jerusalem and Tel Aviv are kind of polarizing places. Jerusalem is very religious. Tel Aviv is very secular. I'd love if there was kind of a vibrant place, down there in the desert besides Beersheba. And it seems kind of strange to me. We talk about that you'd have such a small country where people are, building on top of one another to cram themselves into a city, and then you've just got a huge amount of space that has no one living in it. So what do you make of that pattern, and what would it take infrastructurally, because we mentioned infrastructure, if Israel decided to fulfill that dream of Ben-Gurion and build another city or two in the slap bang middle of the desert where there's only sand dunes? What would that process actually look like of getting everything you need to make a city a city? And I wonder about the foundation of the state of Israel as well, the extent to which this stuff was in place in the mandate period, or whether, because you think about a country, you have to put down roads, you have to put down a whole lot of infrastructure. How would that process look like if Israel decided to do this?
Herman, I was thinking about that drive Daniel was mentioning in his prompt today. That stretch along Route 10 near the Egyptian border. It really is one of the most surreal landscapes on the planet. You can drive for an hour and see absolutely nothing but prehistoric rock formations and the occasional military outpost. It makes you realize just how lopsided the population distribution in this country really is. It's staggering when you look at the raw data, Corn. And by the way, for those just tuning in, I am Herman Poppleberry.
To Daniel's point, Israel is roughly 22,000 square kilometers. That is about the size of New Jersey. But while New Jersey is fairly evenly spread out, Israel has this incredible density in the center. We're talking about nearly 10 million people now in early 26, and the vast majority are squeezed into that thin coastal strip between Gedera and Heder Tethera.
And that is exactly what Daniel was poking at. He mentioned the Central Bureau of Statistics and how they define a city. It is true, they have a very low threshold. Sometimes a place with only 20,000 people is technically a city here. But when we talk about a vibrant major metropolis, we are really talking about something else entirely. We are talking about the dream David Ben-Gurion had. He famously said that the future of Israel in the Negev, he wanted to see a milliard Kiev. He faded.
He did, and he led by example, moving to Kibbutz Saboker. But here we are, decades later, and while Beersheba has grown into a significant high-tech and medical hub, the deep desert remains largely as it was. Daniel's question is the right one. What would it actually take from an infrastructure perspective to build a brand new, vibrant city from scratch in the middle of the Negev Taye? We are not just talking about a few apartment blocks, we are talking about the defined
It is a massive engineering challenge. I think the first place we have to start is the most obvious one. Water. You cannot have a city without it, and the Negev gets almost no rainfall. Historically, Israel solved this with a national water carrier in the 1960s, which pumped water from the Sea of Galilee down south. But that system is basically at capacity, and the Galilee isn't a bottomless well. If we want to build a new city of, say, 500,000 people in the middle of the desert in 26, where does that work?
It has to come from the sea, Corn. Desalination is the only viable path. We already get about 80% of our domestic water from desalination plants along the Mediterranean coast, like the ones in Sorek and Hadera. But if you build a city in the deep Negev, you have to transport that water. You are talking about massive pipelines running 60, 70, or 100 kilometers inland, and more importantly, you are pumping it uphill. The elevation gain from the coast to some parts of the Neg is hundreds of meters.
That brings up a great point about the second-order effects. If you want water, you need energy. If you want a green, sustainable city in the desert, you have to look at solar. We have plenty of sun in the Negev, but as we discussed back in episode 2219, when we talked about industrial-scale infrastructure, solar isn't just about putting panels in the sand. You need massive battery storage to keep the city running at night. You need a smart grid that can handle the trait.
Exactly, and you have to consider the dust. The Negev is prone to massive sandstorms. If your entire city's power depends on solar rays, and a sandstorm covers them in a layer of silt, your power output drops to near zero instantly. You would need robotic cleaning systems, perhaps similar to the computer use agents we talked about in episode 213, to constantly maintain those panels. So right off the bat, the foundation of this city isn't concrete, it's a high-tech loop of desalination and storage.
Let's talk about the physical foundations for a second. Daniel mentioned his grandfather was a traveling salesperson for electricity poles. That is a great image because it reminds us that before the first house is built, you need the grid. In the desert, the soil is often loose or sandy. It is not as stable as the limestone we have here in Jerusalem. Building high-density apartment buildings requires deep pilings and a different kind of structural engineering to deal with the extreme tempests.
That thermal stress is brutal on materials. Roads crack faster, pipes expand and contract, and glass needs to be incredibly high-spec to handle the ultraviolet radiation. But I want to go back to something Daniel asked about the mandate period. He wondered how much of the current infrastructure was already in place back then. The answer is almost none of it in the south. The British mandate mostly focused on the railway lines between Cairo and Haifa and the Haifa, and the Haifa fight. I think that when the
Which is why building a new city today would be so much more complex. In the 1950s, you could just build a few rows of concrete blocks, call it a development town, and move people in. That doesn't work anymore. People won't move to the desert for a concrete block. They want the Tel Aviv lifestyle. They want high-speed internet, cultural centers, and specialized jobs. So the infrastructure has to include a massive connectivity play.
Right. You cannot have a vibrant city if it is an island. You need a high-speed rail link that gets you to Tel Aviv in 40 minutes. If you look at the current plans for the Israel 2040 and 2050 projects, they are talking about extending the rail line all the way to Eilat. A new city in the middle of the Negev would need to be a major stop on that line. Without that physical connection to the rest of the country's economy, the city just becomes a subsidized dormitory.
It is the chicken and the egg problem. You need the people to justify the train, but you need the train to attract the people. And then there is the question of why. Why would someone leave a vibrant place like Jerusalem or the tech hub of Herzliya to live in a new city in the sand? It has to be more than just cheap housing. It has to be a specialized economy. Maybe this new city becomes the world capital of desert tech or renewable energy research.
That is the only way it works. You create a cluster. Think about what happened in Beersheba with the relocation of the military's intelligence units. That brought thousands of high-quality jobs and their families to the south. A new city would need a similar anchor. Maybe it's a massive data center hub because you have the space and the solar power, or a specialized aerospace testing zone. You build the infrastructure for the industry first, and the city grows around it.
I love that idea, but let's pause there for a moment. We need to take a quick break for our sponsors.
As D Firetees, it mild presenter reference. It is a proprietary carbon fiber-lined head tent that creates a personal microclimate of exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the ambient temperature thermometers. Using our patented mit Korle kite, the Solar Shield Hatbrella cone, the Solar Shield Hatbrella ensures that not a single grain of delot chatizeret, you smells a billa kemin filed.
Thanks, Larry. I think I will stick to my regular sun hat for now. Anyway, Herman, before the break we were talking about the anchor industries, but let's get into the nitty-gritty of urban planning for a desert city. If we are starting from a blank slate in 26, we shouldn't be building like we did in the 80s.
Absolutely not. The biggest mistake in early desert towns was trying to copy European urban design. They built wide boulevards and big open squares. In the Negev, that is a disaster. Wide streets act as heat sinks and wind tunnels for sand. A truly vibrant desert city needs to be dense and shaded. We should be looking at ancient Middle Eastern architecture, but with 21st century materials. Think narrow, winding streets that provide natural shade, or mashrobia.
It is funny you say that, because it connects back to the war on the screen we discussed in episode 252. If we are building a city from scratch, we can integrate the digital layer into the physical environment. Imagine a city where the buildings themselves are smart. They adjust their orientation or their shading based on real-time weather data. Or a city designed entirely around autonomous transport, so you don't need massive hot parking lots. You could have a much more walkable, livable environment, 42 key to...
That is the dream, isn't it? But there is a massive hurdle we haven't mentioned yet, the environment. The Negev isn't actually an empty space. It is a fragile ecosystem. When you build a city for 500,000 people, you are destroying habitats. You are changing the drainage patterns of the wadis, the dry riverbeds that flash flood in the winter. The infrastructure has to include incredibly sophisticated flood management. If you pave over the desert, the water has nowhere's rain-ins
Right, and we have seen how devastating those flash floods can be. So, you are looking at a city built on stilts or with massive underground reservoirs to capture that water. It is almost like building a space station on Earth. You have to be entirely self-contained. Waste management is another one. You can't just have a landfill in the middle of the desert. The wind will carry trash for miles. You need a closed-loop system where every bit of waste is recycled or turned into on-surf.
It's the ultimate circular city challenge. And to Daniel's point about the population density, if we actually achieved this, it would fundamentally change the character of Israel. Right now, the country feels like a very small, crowded room. If you open up the south with a vibrant, high-tech metropolis, the country suddenly feels much larger. It shifts the center of gravity. But I wonder, Corn, do you think people actually want that? Or do we just love the idea of the desert as this other place where we go to hikes and it?
That is a deep question. There is a certain romanticism to the emptiness of the Negev. But when you look at the housing prices in Tel Aviv and even here in Jerusalem, the economic reality is forcing the issue. People need somewhere to live. The problem is that historically the periphery has been treated as a second-class option. To make a new city work, it has to be a first-class destination from day one. It can't be the cheap place in the desert. It has to be the cool, futuristic city where the best job.
Which brings us back to the role of the government and the foundations Daniel mentioned. This isn't something the private sector can do alone. You need a massive multi-decade commitment of state resources. You need to build the hospital, the university, and the theater before the people even arrive. It is a huge risk. If you build it and they don't come, you spend billions on a ghost town. But if you don't build the high-end infrastructure first, the people definitely won't come.
It reminds me of the New Towns movement in the United Kingdom after World War II, but on steroids. Those were built to relieve the pressure on London. Some worked, some didn't. The ones that worked were the ones that managed to create their own identity and their own economy. In Israel, we have the development towns like Dimona or Yeruham. They were built with good intentions. But for a long time, they lacked the high-level infrastructure to really compete with the center.
And that is the cautionary tale. If you just build housing, you aren't building a city. You are building a suburb of nowhere. To fulfill Ben-Gurion's dream, you have to build a soul. And that comes from culture. So, the infrastructure needs to include museums, parks that use recycled water, and vibrant public spaces that are actually usable in the heat. Maybe the city is partially underground, like the low-line projects we see in some cities, where you used the tal of the cocktail.
Imagine a city of sunken courtyards. You walk through the city at a level 5 meters below the desert floor, where it is naturally 10 degrees cooler, and the roof of the city is a park made of solar panels and greenery. That would be a world-class architectural marvel. People would move there just to be part of that experiment.
Now you are talking. That is the kind of vision that actually moves the needle. But let's get practical for a second. If we were to start today in January 26, what is the first step? I'd say it's the legal and planning infrastructure. In Israel, getting a building permit can take a decade. To build a whole city, you need a special national infrastructure committee with the power to bypass the usual red tape. You need a master plan that looks 50 years ahead.
And you need to involve the people who already live in the Negev. We can't forget that there are Bedouin communities and smaller kibbutzim already there. Any new city has to be integrated with the existing population, not just dropped on top of them like a spaceship. That social infrastructure is just as important as the water pipes. If the new city creates a dual-class society in the desert, it will fail.
That is a crucial point. It has to be an engine of prosperity for the whole region. It should provide the high-level medical care and education that the smaller desert communities currently have to travel to Beersheba or the center for. It becomes a regional hub. But I also think about the digital fingerprinting we discussed in episode 250. A new city is a chance to build a data-first urban environment. We could track every drop of water, every kilowatt of power, and optimize the city in real time.
It would be the ultimate smart city, but we have to be careful not to make it feel sterile. One of the things Daniel loves about Jerusalem is its grit and its history. You can't manufacture that. A new city can feel very plastic if you aren't careful. You need to leave room for the city to grow organically. You need loose spaces where people can start small businesses or create art without everything being pre-planned by a committee.
That is the hardest part for planners. They want to control everything, but the best parts of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem are the parts that the planners didn't expect, so maybe the infrastructure should be modular. You provide the core, the water, the power, the transport, and then you let the neighborhoods develop their own character over time.
I like that. Provide the skeleton and let the city grow its own skin. So, if we're looking at takeaways for our listeners, what can we learn from this thought experiment? First, that density isn't just a numbers game. It's a design challenge. Israel is dense because we haven't yet mastered the infrastructure of the desert.
Second, that the foundations of a city in 26 are no longer just stone and mortar. They are data, energy storage, and water reclamation. If you solve those three, you can build a city anywhere, even on Mars, which isn't that much different from the deep Negev in some ways.
And third, that connectivity is the lifeblood of a modern city. A city that isn't connected to the global economy via high-speed transport and high-speed data is just a collection of buildings. To make the Negev bloom, we don't just need water, we need bandwidth in every sense of the word.
Well said, Corn. It really makes you look at those empty spaces on the map differently. They aren't just nothing. They are a massive opportunity, provided we have the courage and the engineering chutzpah to actually build there.
I think Daniel's grandfather would be proud to see those new electricity poles going up. It's a continuation of that same pioneering spirit, just with better technology.
And hopefully better hats thanks to Larry.
Hopefully not. Anyway, this has been a fascinating dive into land use. It's one of those topics that seems dry pun intended until you realize it's actually about how we choose to live together as a society.
Exactly. It's about the future of our home. And speaking of our home, if you've been enjoying these deep dives into the weird prompts Daniel sends our way, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or whatever podcast app you use. It genuinely helps other curious minds find the show.
It really does. We love seeing the community grow. You can find all our past episodes and a way to get in touch at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We are also on Spotify, so make sure to follow us there for the latest episodes every week.
Thanks for joining us for episode 255. It's been a blast as always.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring those rabbit holes. This has been My Weird Prompts.
I'm Herman Poppleberry, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.